Welcome to today's Triple Z. The Triple Z podcast is a daily program that you can use to help you fall asleep each night. Just turn down the volume, lay back, relax, and enjoy as you fall asleep. We saw that our podcast was topping the charts in Iceland, so we are going to read their Wikipedia entry. Let's learn about this interesting country in the dullest way possible. If you enjoy our program, please be sure to write us a review on your podcast platform and share us with a friend. You both might sleep just a little better at night. Our website is Triple Z, that's 3zs.media. You can also like and share our content on Facebook or our Instagram account ZZZ Media Podcast. Music for today's episode was provided by the Sleep channel on Spotify. Iceland is a Nordic island country in the North Atlantic Ocean and in the Arctic Ocean. Iceland is the most sparsely populated country in Europe. Iceland's capital and largest city is Reykjavik, which is home to about 36% of the population. Iceland is the largest part of the mid-Atlantic ridge that rises above sea level, and its central volcanic plateau is erupting almost constantly. The interior consists of a plateau characterized by sand and lava fields, mountains, and glaciers, and many glacial rivers flow to the sea through the lowlands. Iceland is warmed by the Gulf Stream and has a temperate climate, despite a high latitude just outside the Arctic Circle. Its high latitude and marine influence keeps summers chilly, and most of its islands have a polar climate. According to the ancient manuscript Landnámabók, the settlement of Iceland began in 874 AD when the Norwegian chieftain Ingolfr Arnarson became the first permanent settler on the island. In the following centuries, Norwegians, and to a lesser extent other Scandinavians, immigrated to Iceland, bringing with them thralls, i.e., slaves or serfs, of Gaelic origin. The island was governed as an independent commonwealth under the native parliament, the Althing, one of the world's oldest functioning legislative assemblies. Following a period of civil strife, Iceland acceded to Norwegian rule in the 13th century. The establishment of the Kalmar Union in 1397 united the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Iceland thus followed Norway's integration into that union, coming under Danish rule after Sweden seceded from the union in 1523. The Danish kingdom forcefully introduced Lutheranism to Iceland in 1550. Influenced by ideals of nationalism after the French Revolution, Iceland's struggle for independence took form and culminated in the Danish-Icelandic Act of Union in 1918, with the establishment of the Kingdom of Iceland, sharing through a personal union the incumbent monarch of Denmark. During the occupation of Denmark in World War II, Iceland voted overwhelmingly to become a republic in 1944, thus ending the remaining formal ties with Denmark. Although the Althing was suspended from 1799 to 1845, the island republic has nevertheless been credited with sustaining the world's oldest and longest-running parliament. Until the 20th century, Iceland relied largely on subsistence fishing and agriculture. Industrialization of the fisheries and Marshall Plan aid following World War II brought prosperity, and Iceland became one of the wealthiest and most developed nations in the world. It became a part of the European Economic Area in 1994. This further diversified the economy into sectors such as finance, biotechnology, and manufacturing. Iceland has a market economy with relatively low taxes compared to other OECD countries, as well as the highest trade union membership in the world. It maintains a Nordic social welfare system that provides universal health care and tertiary education for its citizens. Iceland ranks highly in international comparisons of national performance, such as quality of life, education, protection of civil liberties, government transparency, and economic freedom. Icelandic culture is founded upon the nation's Scandinavian heritage. Most Icelanders are descendants of Norse and Gaelic settlers. Icelandic, a North Germanic language, is descended from Old West Norse and is closely related to Faroese. The country's cultural heritage includes traditional Icelandic cuisine, Icelandic literature, and medieval sagas. Iceland has the smallest population of any NATO member and is the only one with no standing army, with a lightly armed coast guard. The sagas of Icelanders say that a Norwegian named Nadid, or Nadador, was the first Norseman to reach Iceland, and in the 9th century he named it Snaland or Snowland because it was snowing. Following Nadid, the Swede Gerar Svavarson arrived, and so the island was then called Gerarsamur, which means Gerar's Isle. Then came a Viking named Floki Vilgerarsson. His daughter drowned en route, then his livestock starved to death. The sagas say that the rather despondent Floki climbed a mountain and saw a fjord, or Narftur, full of icebergs, which led him to give the island its new and present name. The notion that Iceland's Viking settlers chose that name to discourage the settlement of their verdant isle is a myth. According to both Landnámabók and Islandingabók, monks known as the Paper lived in Iceland before Scandinavian settlers arrived, possibly members of a Hiberno-Scottish mission. Recent archaeological excavations have revealed the ruins of a cabin in Hafnir on the Reykjanes Peninsula. Carbon dating indicates that it was abandoned sometime between 770 and 880. In 2016, archaeologists uncovered a longhouse in Svartur that has been dated to as early as 800. Swedish Viking explorer Gerar Svavarson was the first to circumnavigate Iceland in 870 and established that it was an island. He stayed during the winter and built a house in Húsavík. Gerar departed the following summer, but one of his men, Notfari, decided to stay behind with 2 slaves. Notfari settled in what is now known as Natfaravik, and he and his slaves became the first permanent residents of Iceland to be documented. The Norwegian Norse chieftain Ingolfur Arnarsson built his homestead in present-day Reykjavik in 874. Ingolfur was followed by many other emigrant settlers, largely Scandinavians, and their thralls, many of whom were Irish or Scottish. By 930, most arable land on the island had been claimed. The Althing, a legislative and judicial assembly, was initiated to regulate the Icelandic Commonwealth. The lack of arable land also served as an impetus to the settlement of Greenland starting in 986. The period of these early settlements coincided with the medieval warm period, when temperatures were similar to those of the early 20th century. At this time, about 25% of Iceland was covered with forest, compared to 1% in the present day. Christianity was adopted by consensus around 999 to 1000, although Norse paganism persisted among segments of the population for some years afterward. The Icelandic Commonwealth lasted until the 13th century, when the political system devised by the original settlers proved unable to cope with the increasing power of Icelandic chieftains. The internal struggles and civil strife of the Age of the Sturlungs led to the signing of the Old Covenant in 1262, which ended the Commonwealth and brought Iceland under the Norwegian crown. Possession of Iceland passed from the Kingdom of Norway 872 to 1397, to the Kalmar Union in 1415, when the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were united. After the breakup of the Union in 1523, it remained a Norwegian dependency as a part of Denmark, Norway. Infertile soil, volcanic eruptions, deforestation, and an unforgiving climate made for harsh life in a society where subsistence depended almost entirely on agriculture. The Black Death swept Iceland twice, first in 1402 to 1404 and again in 1494 to 1495. The former outbreak killed 50% to 60% of the population, and the latter 30% to 50%. Around the middle of the 16th century, as part of the Protestant Reformation, King Christian III of Denmark began to impose Lutheranism on all his subjects. John Eyre's son, the last Catholic Bishop of Holar, was beheaded in 1550 along with two of his sons. The country subsequently became officially Lutheran, and Lutheranism has since remained the dominant religion. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Denmark imposed harsh trade restrictions on Iceland. Natural disasters, including volcanic eruptions and disease, contributed to a decreasing population. In the summer of 1627, Barbary pirates committed the events known locally as the Turkish abductions, in which hundreds of residents were taken into slavery in North Africa and dozens killed. This was the only invasion in Icelandic history to have casualties. The 1707-08 Iceland smallpox epidemic is estimated to have killed a quarter to a third of the population. In 1783, the Loki volcano erupted, with devastating effects. In the years following the eruption, known as the Mist Hardships, Icelandic Mjöherndin, over half of all livestock in the country died. Around a quarter of the population starved to death in the ensuing famine. In 1814, following the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark-Norway was broken up into two separate kingdoms via the Treaty of Kiel, but Iceland remained a Danish dependency. Throughout the 19th century, the country's climate continued to grow colder, resulting in mass emigration to the New World, particularly to the region of Gimli, Manitoba in Canada, which was sometimes referred to as New Iceland. About 15,000 people emigrated out of a total population of 70,000. A national consciousness arose in the first half of the 19th century, inspired by romantic and nationalist ideas from mainland Europe. An Icelandic independence movement took shape in the 1850s under the leadership of John Sigurðsson, based on the burgeoning Icelandic nationalism inspired by the Fjalnismenn and other Danish-educated Icelandic intellectuals. In 1874, Denmark granted Iceland a constitution and limited home rule. This was expanded in 1904, and Hannes Hafstein served as the first minister for Iceland in the Danish cabinet. The Danish-Icelandic Act of Union, an agreement with Denmark signed on December 1, 1918 and valid for 25 years, recognized Iceland as a fully sovereign and independent state in a personal union with Denmark. The government of Iceland established an embassy in Copenhagen and requested that Denmark carry out on its behalf certain defense and foreign affairs matters, subject to consultation with the Althing. Danish embassies around the world displayed two coats of arms and two flags, those of the Kingdom of Denmark and those of the Kingdom of Iceland. Iceland's legal position became comparable to those of countries belonging to the Commonwealth of Nations, such as Canada, whose sovereign is King Charles III. During World War II, Iceland joined Denmark in asserting neutrality. After the German occupation of Denmark on April 9, 1940, the Althing replaced the king with a regent and declared that the Icelandic government would take control of its own defense and foreign affairs. A month later, British armed forces conducted Operation Fork, the invasion and occupation of the country, violating Icelandic neutrality. In 1941, the government of Iceland, friendly to Britain, invited the then neutral United States to take over its defense so that Britain could use its troops elsewhere. On December 31, 1943, the Danish-Icelandic Act of Union expired after 25 years. Beginning on May 20, 1944, Icelanders voted in a 4-day plebiscite on whether to terminate the personal union with Denmark, abolish the monarchy, and establish a republic. The vote was 97% to end the union and 95% in favor of the new republican constitution. Iceland formally became a republic on June 17, 1944, with Svein Björnsson as its first president. In 1946, the U.S. Defense Force Allied left Iceland. The nation formally became a member of NATO on March 30, 1949, amid domestic controversy and riots. On May 5, 1951, a defense agreement was signed with the United States. American troops returned to Iceland as the Iceland Defense Force and remained throughout the Cold War. The U.S. withdrew the last of its forces on September 30, 2006. Iceland prospered during the Second World War. The immediate post-war period was followed by substantial economic growth, driven by the industrialization of the fishing industry and the U.S. Marshall Plan program, through which Icelanders received the most aid per capita of any European country, at $209, with the war-ravaged Netherlands a distant second at $109. Vigdis Finnbogadóttir assumed Iceland's presidency on August 1, 1980, making her the first elected female head of state in the world. The 1970s were marked by the Cod Wars, several disputes with the United Kingdom over Iceland's extension of its fishing limits to 200 nmi, 370 kilometers, offshore. Iceland hosted a summit in Reykjavik in 1986 between United States President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, during which they took significant steps towards nuclear disarmament. A few years later, Iceland became the first country to recognize the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as they broke away from the USSR. Throughout the 1990s, the country expanded its international role and developed a foreign policy oriented towards humanitarian and peacekeeping causes. To that end, Iceland provided aid and expertise to various NATO-led interventions in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq. Iceland joined the European Economic Area in 1994, after which the economy was greatly diversified and liberalized. International economic relations increased further after 2001, when Iceland's newly deregulated banks began to raise great amounts of external debt, contributing to a 32% increase in Iceland's gross national income between 2002 and 2007. In 2003 to 2007, following the privatization of the banking sector under the government of David's son, Iceland moved towards having an economy based on international investment banking and financial services. It was quickly becoming one of the most prosperous countries in the world, but was hit hard by a major financial crisis. The crisis resulted in the greatest migration from Iceland since 1887, with a net emigration of 5,000 people in 2009. Iceland's economy stabilized under the government of Jóhanna Sigurðardóttir and grew by 1.6% in 2012. The center-right Independence Party was returned to power in coalition with the Progressive Party in the 2013 election. In the following years, Iceland saw a surge in tourism as the country became a popular holiday destination. In 2016, Prime Minister Sigmundur Davíð Gunnlaugsson resigned after being implicated in the Panama Papers scandal. Early elections in 2016 resulted in a right-wing coalition government of the Independence Party, the Reform Party, and Bright Future. This government fell when Bright Future quit the coalition due to a scandal involving then Prime Minister Bjarni Benediktson's father's letter of support for a convicted child sex offender. Snap elections in October 2017 brought to power a new coalition consisting of the Independence Party, the Progressive Party, and the Left Green Movement, headed by Katrín Jakobsdóttir. After the 2021 parliamentary election, the new government was, just like the previous government, a tri-party coalition of the Independence Party, the Progressive Party, and the Left Green Movement, headed by Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir. Iceland is at the juncture of the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. The main island is entirely south of the Arctic Circle, which passes through the small Icelandic island of Grímsey off the main island's northern coast. The country lies between latitudes 63 and 68 degrees north and longitudes 25 and 13 degrees west. Iceland is closer to continental Europe than to mainland North America, although it is closest to Greenland, 290 kilometers, 155 nautical miles, an island of North America. Iceland is generally included in Europe for geographical, historical, political, cultural, linguistic, and practical reasons. Geologically, the island includes parts of both continental plates. The closest bodies of land in Europe are the Faroe Islands, 420 kilometers, 225 nmi, Jan Mayen Island, 570 kilometers, 310 nmi, Shetland and the Outer Hebrides, both about 740 kilometers, 400 nmi, and the Scottish mainland and Orkney, both about 750 kilometers, 405 nmi. The nearest part of continental Europe is mainland Norway, about 970 kilometers, 525 nmi away, while mainland North America is 2,070 kilometers, 1,120 nmi away, at the northern tip of Labrador. Iceland is the world's 18th largest island and Europe's second largest island after Great Britain and before Ireland. The main island covers 101,826 square kilometers, 39,315 square miles, but the entire country is 103,000 square kilometers, 40,000 square miles, in size, of which 62.7% is tundra. Iceland contains about 30 minor islands, including the lightly populated Grímsey and the Vestmannaeyjar archipelago. Lakes and glaciers cover 14.3% of its surface, only 23% is vegetated. The largest lakes are Risvatn Reservoir, 83 to 88 square kilometers, 32 to 34 square miles, and Ingvallavatn, 82 square kilometers, 32 square miles. Other important lakes include Laugardalsvatn and Mývatn. Jökulsárlón is the deepest lake at 248 meters, 814 feet. Geologically, Iceland is part of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a ridge along which the oceanic crust spreads and forms new crust. This part of the mid-ocean ridge is located above a mantle plume, causing Iceland to be subaerial, above the surface of the sea. The ridge marks the boundary between the Eurasian and North American plates, and Iceland was created by rifting and accretion through volcanism along the ridge. Many fjords punctuate Iceland's 4,970 km long, 3,088 miles coastline, which is also where most settlements are situated. The island's interior, the Highlands of Iceland, is a cold and uninhabitable combination of sand, mountains, and lava fields. The major towns are the capital city of Reykjavik, along with its outlying towns of Kópavogur, Hafnarfjörður, and Garðabær, nearby Reykjanesbær, where the international airport is located, and the town of Akureyri in northern Iceland. The island of Grimsey on the Arctic Circle contains the northernmost habitation of Iceland, whereas Kolbeinsey contains the northernmost point of Iceland. Iceland has 3 national parks: Vatnajökull National Park, Snæfellsjökull National Park, and Ingvellir National Park. The country is considered a strong performer in environmental protection, having been ranked 13th in Yale University's Environmental Performance Index of 2012. A geologically young land at 16 to 18 million years old, Iceland is the surface expression of the Iceland Plateau, a large igneous province forming as a result of volcanism from the Iceland hotspot and along the mid-Atlantic ridge, the latter of which runs right through it. This means that the island is highly geologically active with many volcanoes including Hekla, Helga, Herubreið, and Eldfell. The volcanic eruption of Laki in 1783 to 1784 caused a famine that killed nearly a quarter of the island's population. In addition, the eruption caused dust clouds and haze to appear over most of Europe and parts of Asia and Africa for several months afterwards, and affected climates in other areas. Iceland has many geysers, including geyser, from which the English word is derived, and the famous Strákur, which erupts every 8 to 10 minutes. After a phase of inactivity, geysers started erupting again after a series of earthquakes in 2000. Geyser has since grown quieter and does not erupt often. With the widespread availability of geothermal power and the harnessing of many rivers and waterfalls for hydroelectricity, most residents have access to inexpensive hot water, heating, and electricity. The island is composed primarily of basalt, a low silica lava associated with effusive volcanism, as has occurred also in Hawaii. Iceland, however, has a variety of volcanic types, composite and fissure, many producing more evolved lavas such as rhyolite and andesite. Iceland has hundreds of volcanoes, with about 30 active volcanic systems. Surtsey, one of the youngest islands in the world, is part of Iceland. Named after Surtur, it rose above the ocean in a series of volcanic eruptions between November 8, 1963 and June 5, 1968. Only scientists researching the growth of new life are allowed to visit the island. On March 21, 2010, a volcano in Eyjafjallajökull in the south of Iceland erupted for the first time since 1821, forcing 600 people to flee their homes. Additional eruptions on April 14 forced hundreds of people to abandon their homes. The resultant cloud of volcanic ash brought major disruption to air travel across Europe. Another large eruption occurred on May 21, 2011. This time it was the Grímsvötn volcano, located under the thick ice of Europe's largest glacier, Vatnajökull. Grímsvötn is one of Iceland's most active volcanoes, and this eruption was much more powerful than the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull activity, with ash and lava hurled 20 kilometers (12 miles) into the atmosphere, creating a large cloud. A great deal of volcanic activity was occurring in the Reykjanes Peninsula in 2020 and into 2021 after nearly 800 years of inactivity. After the eruption of the Fagradalsfjall volcano on March 19, 2021, National Geographic's experts predicted that this may mark the start of decades of volcanic activity. The eruption was small, leading to a prediction that this volcano was unlikely to threaten any population centers. The highest elevation for Iceland is listed as 2,110 meters, 6,920 feet, at Vanadalshnúkur, 64 degrees 0 minutes north, 16 degrees 39 minutes west. The climate of Iceland's coast is subarctic. The warm North Atlantic current ensures generally higher annual temperatures than in most places of similar latitude in the world. Regions in the world with similar climates include the Aleutian Islands, the Alaska Peninsula, and Tierra del Fuego, although these regions are closer to the equator. Despite its proximity to the Arctic, the island's coasts remain ice-free through the winter. Ice incursions are rare, with the last having occurred on the north coast in 1969. The climate varies between different parts of the island. Generally speaking, the south coast is warmer, wetter, and windier than the north. The Central Highlands are the coldest part of the country. Low-lying inland areas in the north are the aridest. Snowfall in winter is more common in the north than in the south. The highest air temperature recorded was 30.5 degrees Celsius (86.9 degrees Fahrenheit) on June 22, 1939 at Tigerhorn on the southeastern coast. The lowest was -38 degrees Celsius (-36.4 degrees Fahrenheit) on January 22, 1918 at Grimstad and Riddler in the northeastern hinterland. The temperature records for Reykjavik are 26.2 degrees Celsius (79.2 degrees Fahrenheit) on July 30, 2008, and -24.5 degrees Celsius (-12.1 degrees Fahrenheit) on January 21, 1918. Phytogeographically, Iceland belongs to the Arctic province of the circumboreal region within the Boreal Kingdom. Plant life consists mainly of grassland, which is regularly grazed by livestock. The most common tree native to Iceland is the northern birch, Betula pubescens, which formerly formed forests over much of Iceland, along with aspens, Populus tremula, rowans, Sorbus aucuparia, common junipers, Juniperus communis, and other smaller trees, mainly willows. When the island was first settled, it was extensively forested, with around 30% of the land covered in trees. In the late 12th century, Ari the Wise described it in the Islandingabók as forested from mountain to seashore. Permanent human settlement greatly disturbed the isolated ecosystem of thin, volcanic soils and limited species diversity. The forests were heavily exploited over the centuries for firewood and timber. Deforestation, climatic deterioration during the Little Ice Age, and overgrazing by sheep imported by settlers caused a loss of critical topsoil due to erosion. Today, many farms have been abandoned. 3/4 of Iceland's 100,000 square kilometers, 39,000 square miles, is affected by soil erosion. 18,000 square kilometers, 6,900 square miles, is affected to a degree serious enough to make the land useless. Only a few small birch stands now exist in isolated reserves. The planting of new forests has increased the number of trees, but the result does not compare to the original forests. Some of the planted forests include introduced species. The tallest tree in Iceland is a Sitka spruce planted in 1949 in Kirkjubæjarklaustur. It was measured at 25.2 meters, 83 feet, in 2013. Algae such as Chondrus crispus, Phyllophora truncata, and Phyllophora crispa and others have been recorded from Iceland. The only native land mammal when humans arrived was the Arctic fox, which came to the island at the end of the Ice Age, walking over the frozen sea. On rare occasions, bats have been carried to the island with the winds, but they are not able to breed there. No native or free-living reptiles or amphibians are on the island. The animals of Iceland include the Icelandic sheep, cattle, chickens, goats, the sturdy Icelandic horse, and the Icelandic sheepdog, all descendants of animals imported by Europeans. Wild mammals include the Arctic fox, mink, mice, rats, rabbits, and reindeer. Polar bears occasionally visit the island, traveling from Greenland on icebergs, but no Icelandic populations exist. In June 2008, 2 polar bears arrived in the same month. Marine mammals include the gray seal, Halicoiris grypus, and harbor seal, Phoca vitulina. Many species of fish live in the ocean waters surrounding Iceland, and the fishing industry is a major part of Iceland's economy, accounting for roughly half of the country's total exports. Birds, especially seabirds, are an important part of Iceland's animal life. Atlantic puffins, skuas, and black-legged kittiwakes nest on its sea cliffs. Commercial whaling is practiced intermittently along with scientific whale hunts. Whale watching has become an important part of Iceland's economy since 1997. Around 1,300 species of insects are known in Iceland. This is low compared with other countries. Over 1 million species have been described worldwide. Iceland is essentially free of mosquitoes. Iceland has a left-right multi-party system. Following the 2017 and 2021 parliamentary elections, the biggest parties are the center-right Independence Party, Sjálvstæðisflokkurin, the Progressive Party, Framsóknarflokkurin, and the left-green movement, Vinstrihreyfingin, Grænt Framboð. These 3 parties form the ruling coalition in the cabinet led by leftist Katrín Jakobsdóttir. Other political parties with seats in the Althing, Parliament, are the Social Democratic Alliance, Samfylkingin, the People's Party, Flokkar Fólksins, Iceland's Pirates, Piratar, the Reform Party, Viðreisn, and the Centre Party, Miðflokkurin. Iceland was the first country in the world to have a political party formed and led entirely by women. Known as the Women's List or Women's Alliance, Kvennalistinn, it was founded in 1983 to advance the political, economic, and social needs of women. After participating in its first parliamentary elections, the Women's List helped increase the proportion of female parliamentarians by 15%. It disbanded in 1999, formally merging the next year with the Social Democratic Alliance, although about half of its members joined the left-green movement instead. It did leave a lasting influence on Iceland's politics. Every major party has a 40% quota for women, and in 2009 nearly a third of members of parliament were female, compared to the global average of 16%. Following the 2016 and 2021 elections, 48% of members of parliament are female. In 2016, Iceland was ranked second in the strength of its democratic institutions and 13th in government transparency. The country has a high level of civic participation, with 81.4% voter turnout during the most recent elections, compared to an OECD average of 72%. However, only 50% of Icelanders say they trust their political institutions, slightly less than the OECD average of 56%, and most probably a consequence of the political scandals in the wake of the Icelandic financial crisis. Iceland is a representative democracy and a parliamentary republic. The modern parliament, Alþingi English, Althing, was founded in 1845 as an advisory body to the Danish monarch. It was widely seen as a re-establishment of the assembly founded in 930 in the Commonwealth period and temporarily suspended from 1799 to 1845. Consequently, it is arguably the world's oldest parliamentary democracy. It has 63 members, elected for a maximum period of 4 years. The head of government is the Prime Minister who, together with the Cabinet, is responsible for executive government. The President of Iceland, in contrast, is a largely ceremonial head of state and serves as a diplomat, but may veto laws voted by the Parliament and put them to a national referendum. They are elected by popular vote for a term of 4 years with no term limit. The current president is Gudni Th. Johannesson. On August 1, 2016, he became the new president of Iceland, and he was re-elected with an overwhelming majority of the vote in the 2020 presidential election. The elections for the president, the Althing, and local municipal councils are all held separately every 4 years. The cabinet in the country's government is typically appointed by the president after a general election to the Althing. However, the appointment is usually negotiated by the leaders of the political parties, who decide amongst themselves which parties can form the cabinet and how to distribute its seats, as long as it has majority support in the Althing. If the party leaders are unable to come to an agreement within a reasonable period of time, the president will personally appoint the cabinet. This has not happened since the Republic was founded in 1944, although in 1942 the regent, Svein Björnsson, appointed a non-parliamentary government. Svein held the practical position of a president at the time, and later became the country's first official president in 1944. The governments of Iceland have always been coalition governments, with 2 or more parties involved, as no single political party has ever received a majority of seats in the Althing throughout the Republican period. There is no legal consensus on the extent of the political power possessed by the office of the president. Several provisions of the Constitution appear to give the president some important powers, but other provisions and traditions suggest differently. In 1980, Icelanders elected Vigdis Finnbogadóttir as president, the world's first directly elected female head of state. She retired from office in 1996. In 2009, Iceland became the first country with an openly gay head of government when Jóhanna Sigurðardóttir became prime minister. Iceland is divided into regions, constituencies, and municipalities. The 8 regions are primarily used for statistical purposes. District court jurisdictions also use an older version of this division. Until 2003, the constituencies for the parliamentary elections were the same as the regions, but by an amendment to the Constitution, they were changed to the current 6 constituencies. Reykjavik North and Reykjavik South, city regions. Southwest, for non-contiguous suburban areas around Reykjavik. Northwest and Northeast, northern half of Iceland, split, and south, southern half of Iceland, excluding Reykjavik and suburbs. The redistricting change was made to balance the weight of different districts of the country, since previously a vote cast in the sparsely populated areas around the country would count much more than a vote cast in the Reykjavik city area. The imbalance between districts has been reduced by the new system, but still exists. 69 municipalities in Iceland govern local matters like schools, transport, and zoning. These are the actual second-level subdivisions of Iceland, as the constituencies have no relevance except in elections and for statistical purposes. Reykjavik is by far the most populous municipality, about 4 times more populous than Kópavogur, the second one. Iceland, which is a member of the UN, NATO, EFTA, Council of Europe, and OECD, maintains diplomatic and commercial relations with practically all nations, but its ties with the Nordic countries, Germany, the United States, Canada, and the other NATO nations are particularly close. Historically, due to cultural, economic, and linguistic similarities, Iceland is a Nordic country, and it participates in intergovernmental cooperation through the Nordic Council. Iceland is a member of the European Economic Area, EEA, which allows the country access to the single market of the European Union, EU. It was not a member of the EU, but in July 2009, the Icelandic Parliament, the Althing, voted in favor of the application for EU membership and officially applied on July 17, 2009. However, in 2013, opinion polls showed that many Icelanders were now against joining the EU. Following the 2013 Icelandic parliamentary election, the two parties that formed the island's new government, the centrist Progressive Party and the right-wing Independence Party, announced they would hold a referendum on EU membership. In 2015, Minister for Foreign Affairs Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson informed the EU that Iceland would no longer pursue membership, but the application was not formally withdrawn, and there have been subsequent calls for a referendum on the issue. Iceland has no standing army but has the Icelandic Coast Guard, which also maintains the Iceland Air Defense System and an Iceland Crisis Response Unit to support peacekeeping missions and perform paramilitary functions. The Iceland Defense Force, IDF, was a military command of the United States Armed Forces from 1951 to 2006. The IDF, created at the request of NATO, came into existence when the United States signed an agreement to provide for the defense of Iceland. The IDF also consisted of civilian Icelanders and military members of other NATO nations. The IDF was downsized after the end of the Cold War, and the U.S. Air Force maintained 4 to 6 interceptor aircraft at the Naval Air Station Keflavik until they were withdrawn on September 30, 2006. Since May 2008, NATO nations have periodically deployed fighters to patrol Icelandic airspace under the Icelandic Air Policing Mission. Iceland supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq despite much domestic controversy, deploying a Coast Guard EOD team to Iraq, which was replaced later by members of the Iceland Crisis Response Unit. Iceland has also participated in the conflict in Afghanistan and the 1999 NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. Despite the ongoing financial crisis, the first new patrol ship in decades was launched on April 29, 2009. Iceland was the neutral host of the historic 1986 Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Reykjavik, which set the stage for the end of the Cold War. Iceland's principal historical international disputes involve disagreements over exclusive economic zones. conflict with the United Kingdom led to a series of so-called Cod Wars, which included confrontations between the Icelandic Coast Guard and the Royal Navy over British fishermen in 1952 to 1956 due to the extension of Iceland's fishing zone from 3 to 4 nmi, 5.6 to 7.4 kilometers, 3.5 to 4.6 miles. In 1958 to 1961, following a further extension to 12 nmi, 22.2 kilometers, 13.8 miles, in 1972 to 1973, with another extension to 50 nmi, 92.6 kilometers, 57.5 miles, and in 1975 to 1976 after another extension to 200 nmi, 370.4 kilometers, 230.2 miles. According to the 2011 Global Peace Index, Iceland is the most peaceful country in the world due to its lack of armed forces, low crime rate, and high level of socio-political stability. Iceland is listed in Guinness World Records as the country ranked most at peace and the lowest military spending per capita. Iceland's official governmental goal is to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by the year 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by the year 2040. The Icelandic Forest Service and other forestry groups promote large-scale reforestation in the country. Before the first human settlement, 25 to 40% of the country was covered by forest. The Vikings cut them for fuel, building, and making iron. Due to the reforestation efforts, the forest cover of Iceland increased sixfold since the 1990s. This helps to offset carbon emissions, prevent sandstorms, and increase the productivity of farms.